The opioid epidemic has claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. In an attempt to provide more options for treatments, the FDA is now pushing for the creation of medication to help curb addiction. In her new book, Dopesick, Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America, Beth Macy talks about the time she spent with people on the front lines of this crisis. And Beth joins us now to talk more about her book. It's great to see you again. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm thrilled to be back.
The book is just stellar and absolutely heartbreaking. The reporting you did is astonishing. Take us to the roots of this crisis. There's this stat that you lay out in southwestern Virginia, how it went from one opioid death to, I think next year it was maybe 6, and then in the teens, and then obviously it's grown from there.
Right. So with the introduction of OxyContin in 1996, Purdue Pharma reps were targeting areas that had high rates of opioid prescribing already, like lower strength pills like Percocet, Vicodin, and Lortab. And so using the data of which doctors prescribe those, they went into these communities that ended up being, of course, the distressed communities where there were coal minings and factories shut down, which I know you've reported on a lot too. And they sent the reps to say, OxyContin's a better product. It's much, much stronger. And that pill ended up being prescribed 300 to 600% more than that in the nationwide average in those distressed communities that I write about in this book, such as Lee County, which is Virginia's westernmost point. And it was just a perfect storm for those communities because right away they started having high schoolers ODing in the library on this drug.
Wow.
They started having almost 0.25% of high school seniors having tried it. 71-year-old farmers becoming addicted who had previously, because of coal mining injuries, taken safely Lortab and taking OxyContin as instructed and still becoming, wildly, immediately addicted to this drug and losing their families, losing their livelihoods, and ultimately losing their lives. And, one man in his 70s said, "I've lost everything. This drug has become my God."
Wow. What was the response from the doctors in the region who were on the front lines? They were writing these prescriptions. Weren't they seeing what was happening here?
Well, there was one physician I focus on in particular, a rural doctor named Art Van Zee, and the only way I could honestly, Krystal, stand to live in this material for 2.5 years was to focus on the people fighting back.
Yeah.
So in 2000, Art Van Zee looks at his caseload of patients and he just sees, previously he had treated 1 or 2 people a year for substance abuse disorder. Now he's seeing his caseload taken over by this. So he writes Purdue a letter. He begs him to take it off the market until it can be reformulated to be abuse resistant, which another drug company had done years earlier, makers of Talwin, when they realized immediately that it was being abused and it was terribly addictive. And they reformulated it. And he writes them a letter in 2000 saying, "My fear is that the distressed communities like where I live are going to be the sentinel areas, just as San Francisco and New York were with HIV." And he was absolutely right. Where he was wrong was that around that time he said, nobody's going to care in our government until the rich kids in the suburbs. When it's just a bunch of poor people in the country, no one cares. And of course he was dead wrong about that. Still, there's been very little action about this crisis, very little national leadership. And Appalachia has just been, a leader I talked to the other day said it's like that drug has been a holocaust in our region.
We talked to, that language. We talked to Mayor Stu Williams of Huntington, West Virginia, which is, one of the overdose capitals of the nation. And he said, we've lost 2 generations.
Yeah. And then you have all the kids in foster care now and
grandparents trying to raise kids on Social Security.
Yes, on disability. One person I interviewed talked about being in middle school and the teacher asking them in the class what they wanted to be when they grew up. And the boy says, "I want to be a drawer." And the teacher says, "An artist?" He says, "No, I want to be somebody who draws disability." Because that was the only way he could foresee feeding his family. Because that was all he saw around him.
Wow. You talked about how this region was targeted because you already had a lot of people who were taking Percocet and other much less strong and also much less addictive prescription drugs. Talk about how the economic situation in this region ties into this crisis and why it took root here in such a strong way.
Yeah, and not just here, but in other distressed areas like Machias, Maine.
Right.
I remember in 2000, Art Van Zee had an intern working in his clinic and went home to visit people in Boston. And there was a story in the Boston Globe that he literally, this is before the internet, right? He literally carries the story back to Lee County and they read it and they go, oh my God, this is us. Same thing. People who had never had to lock their doors, locking doors, murders happening over this drug.
Right.
Crime through the roof.
And these were like loggers and fishers who had blue collar work that had been tough on their body.
Yes, and the other thing that was also happening, it's a very nuanced situation, is people would get addicted and then they would either themselves or talk a friend, maybe who had some minor injuries, into going to a doctor, and it was called get them to write you. Get a doctor who had been told by Purdue that this was a safe drug, exquisitely rare was the quote on addiction, less than 1%. Get somebody to write you, which means like write you a prescription for OxyContin. And if you were on Medicaid, you could get that prescription for $1 or $2. You could then sell half of it and make thousands of dollars. So it became its own resource,
its own economy in a
like
region
moonshine.
Where, that's right. The pharmaceutical company, I mean, Purdue, which is the manufacturer of OxyContin, does not come off looking good in your book. When did they realize there was an issue, and what steps have they taken?
Well, they said for many years that they didn't know until early 2000, but according to recent documents written about in the New York Times just last month, they knew very early on. If you go and you interview the first police lieutenant in that region, he saw it as early as 1997. He said, a confidential informant leans into his cruiser and has said, this fella up here's got this thing he's selling. It's called OxyContin, and it's great. He calls the pharmacist says, it's already on the street.
Wow.
And he said, we're gonna have, mark my words, we're gonna have a disaster with this if it's already being diverted and abused. And they were hearing they were hearing these reports early on. It has recently come to light.
What is the current state of affairs? I mean, as you say, this addiction is not limited to Appalachia, but that's your particular region of specialty and focus, you having lived there and been a reporter there for many years too. Are things getting better?
Well, so doctors aren't prescribing the way they once were. CDC guidelines in 2016 were, better late than never, but the situation now is in this country, we have 2.6 million people with opioid use disorder, and very little urgency from state and federal governments to provide them what science says is the best treatment. Too often they get arrested because many users also have to deal in order to get their own supply. Too often they get arrested and they get remanded to treatment, which is abstinence only. And study after study show that medication-assisted treatment, which are maintenance drugs such as buprenorphine and methadone, are the best way to prevent overdose deaths. And where I live, there just is no easy access to get these drugs. So I live in Roanoke, Virginia, on the outskirts of Appalachia, and there's a 3-week waiting list to get to see a drug. There aren't enough doctors in the nation who are willing to become waivered to prescribe buprenorphine because they don't say this out loud, but I know what it is. They don't want, quote, addicts in their waiting room.
Right.
And because they're difficult cases.
Yeah.
And I said this recently at a healthcare forum in Roanoke with a room full of doctors. I said, got a little emotional. I was holding this picture of a young woman I had followed for 2.5 years who got addicted originally at an urgent care by being overprescribed, and then she passed away. And I just felt like I was speaking for her, and I said, look, you guys helped us get in this situation. You were misled, yes, but you also took a lot of free things.
Yeah.
A lot of 5,000 of you
perks.
Went to Florida, and I feel like, for these Purdue-sponsored training events, I feel that any doctor that accepted a free item from a pharmaceutical company should feel morally compelled to do the training and then become certified in
part
addiction.
of the solution.
Yes.
Amen.
Yes.
Beth Macy, it is a heartbreaking, beautiful, compelling book. Every American should read it. Every policymaker should read it. Thank you so much for being with us to discuss it.
It's an honor.
Really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Krystal.
We'll have more Rising after this.